Look, I'm 32. I'm going to be 33 within a month of the release of this video. I'm 1/3 through my life right now, if I'm being generous, and a part of me is okay with that, and another part of me is, well, I'm not necessarily scared of the idea of death, but I'm more or less unsure if I've fully processed with the fact that at some point one day, I'll just not be around anymore. And I think the disconnect is the fact that I don't mean like I'll be inside a lot more than I already am and just not be around for people when they need me, but the fact that I'll literally be gone. A fragmented discourse of ideas and interpretations of everything that I stood for and felt. I played my first real horror game in 2004 with the Resident Evil remake on the GameCube, and I could go in depth on how much that game means to me, but I've literally made a video on that exact subject right here. It has ingrained itself so hard into my gaming DNA that whenever I think of a horror game, I immediately, subconsciously, compare it to the classic Resident Evil games. For a long time, horror games, let alone survival horror games akin to the classic style of Resident Evil, were basically as dead as the zombies you shot at. As someone who truly loved that type of game, it made me sort of lose faith in gaming in general, when games during the 360 era sort of became homogenized to the point where so many franchises and IPs that I had history with and loved, let alone new IPs and franchises that I was either discovering for the first time like Dead Space, or even established ones like, I don't know, Resident Evil, were drifting far enough away from their original IP's vision in such an obvious attempt to cash in on the Call of Duty train that it made the new games feel like they almost didn't even belong to the franchise that they were technically a part of. But recently, in the last few years, horror games in particular have seen such a massive resurgence in popularity that it has not only rejuvenated my love for the genre, from massive AAA games like the Resident Evil 2 remake to indie horror games like Signalis and My Friendly Neighborhood, that made me realize that horror is back in full force. But playing through Crow Country made me realize with a gigantic smile on my face that not only is survival horror back, but survival horror is forever. I mean it when I say that Crow Country is mostly pure old school survival horror. From the tank controls, the relatively fixed camera, to the pre-rendered aesthetically designed backgrounds, and a strong emphasis on the scarcity of ammo and the danger of nearly every enemy in the game that could potentially kill you if you aren't careful enough. You solve puzzles, you find items to unlock your way through a well-designed Metroidvania-styled puzzle box, and you even have a wonderful self-contained little story that is genuinely intriguing, and while not tackling anything heavy, does have enough going on that it keeps you guessing and does have a satisfying payoff at the end. What separates Crow Country well enough from its peers, however, at least visually, especially in the indie scene, is that it utilizes a very unique visual flair that is less classic Resident Evil and much more Final Fantasy VII. The RPG pre-rendered aesthetic is one that I don't see too often being utilized, not only as a nostalgic hit piece, but as a legitimate visual style that can stand on its own. What Crow Country does with it is not necessarily anything like mind-blowing, but it does offer a unique visual charm that, at least to me, instantly made me drawn to the game, even beyond its mechanical emphasis on my heartstrings. This visual style pairs excellently with its main prominent location, the titular abandoned theme park of Crow Country. To those not in the know, I love the vibe of haunted, evil, spooky, creepy carnivals or theme parks. So much so that I even had an ICP phase growing up in high school. There is something so deliciously satisfying about this aesthetic that I could eat it up like a gigantic glob of spiderwebbed cotton candy, minus the spiders, and Crow Country leans hard into this and doesn't ever really let it up. The only time that the game even slightly leans off this visual flair is when you're in the back rooms of the park and start to venture beyond into the late game. And even then, it's hardly a lean off this visual style or aesthetic at all. Wandering around the abandoned Crow Country theme park and discovering secret pathways, making a mental map and deducing the fastest way across the map to use a new puzzle item that you've acquired is absolutely peak survival horror. It often feels like you're wandering through a dream as the game progresses, and you start to doubt yourself as you start to see enemies spawning in places that you know they shouldn't be, items popping up in locations that they weren't before, and hazards suddenly appearing in your favorite walkback locations or shortcuts. The vibes of the game are honestly just off the charts, and it does an excellent job of recreating the old school aesthetic while maintaining a modern visual flair that simply couldn't be recreated using older technology with its dynamic, shiftable camera. But the core of survival horror is where Crow Country shines the brightest. It doesn't change much of the core design tenets of the genre, but it focuses on them in a way that demonstrates what makes the genre so enticing to people that still love it to this day. It emphasizes ammo management, but it makes it a bit less stressful this time around due to the fact that you can search trash bins that are scattered around the game world to potentially discover extra bullets. Now, on face value, this may sound like they nerfed the entire mantra of the genre, but believe me when I say that this mechanic doesn't get in the way of the eventual desperately low ammo count that one may tend to have in a game like this. Unless you actively do not engage with basically any enemy in the game on your first playthrough, then you will still find yourself at a low pistol count, and unless you're me, who couldn't find the shotgun for roughly half the playthrough and just secured an obscene amount of shotgun shells, you'll find yourself very low on shells as well. I said earlier that survival horror tends to have a Metroidvania-style puzzle box, and to be more specific, I believe that survival horror games are basically just 3D Metroidvanias. In the sense that you're given a certain amount of space at the start of the game, and you can steadily unlock more and more of the game's map as you discover certain items or solve certain puzzles. But the biggest difference between the two genres, at least to me, is that Metroidvanias focus less on puzzles than survival horror does. And in terms of my love for the genre, I think that's where survival horror really stands out and separates itself from the companion genre. Puzzles in survival horror are perfect tempo changes in gameplay. You may encounter a stream of action, or barely making it out of an encounter with a horde of enemies, or even just a single boss encounter. And what better way to spice up the pacing of that than to slow it down a bit and make your brain work a little with an inclusion of a puzzle or two to help tide you over until the next small explosion of action. The puzzles in Crow Country are plentiful, but maybe a few too many of them rely on the classic find item, use item style of puzzle that the genre relies on a bit. There are just enough, however, that require the actual use of your brain, and they range from almost frustratingly simple to very well designed and difficult brain teasers. What's nice about Crow Country's puzzles, though, is that the hardest ones are usually optional and provide special secrets like a special weapon and weapon attachments. One of them in particular, involving a train set, was so tricky and I couldn't quite wrap my head around it, and after beating my head against a wall for about an hour, I realized it was optional and I just peaced out. But all this doesn't mean that the game doesn't have its fair share of well-balanced puzzles. Regardless of some of the game's puzzles' shortcomings, it will never not bring a smile to my face to play a survival horror game with puzzles of this quality, however somewhat inconsistent that they may be. But I will say that despite its relatively unique setting and visual vibe, it doesn't do too much outside of the genre tropes, and while it does dangle a few interesting mysteries and plot twists, it's not too hard to see where the overall story is going or find its broader plot much other than acceptable or one that works. And that's not to say that the game's story is just outright forgettable, as there are plenty of things that are set up, and at least one of them is paid off in a very effective manner that did recontextualize a lot of the game's plot up until that point. Also, throughout the game, you encounter and interact with several characters that all have their own agendas and reasons for being here in this abandoned theme park. Trying to find which ones are trustworthy and which ones are there for malicious intent is a real joy as the game progresses. You also have many moments during conversations with these characters where you're given a choice on how to interact with them. I didn't have time to see all of the variables before this review was due, but knowing that your decisions affect not only the game's narrative, but also your main character's character, was a nice little subversion to the classic formula that I appreciated quite a bit. And this is where I would have discussed my final thoughts on Crow Country, but I literally woke up this morning to the news that Microsoft closed yet more studios. Tango Gameworks, the creators of the excellent Hi-Fi Rush and The Evil Within, as well as Arcane Austin, the creators of Prey and Redfall. With all of the layoffs going on in the game industry, with Embracer Group being the number one culprit in the eyes of the public, it's easy to think that the gaming industry right now is in a dark age, and in many, many cases, yes, that is the case. Such as with live service games leading the AAA campaign and killing smaller game ideas, microtransactions are causing more and more scrutiny and anger in consumers. Games that theoretically do well in every department are still being considered failures in the eyes of corporations that are also doing everything that they can in order to bleed you dry of your money at the same time that CEOs are unsurprisingly taking massive pay raises while killing studios, developers, and livelihoods. If you only ever look at gaming through this lens of AAA and formulate your opinion on the state of the industry right now, I could never blame you for being a doomer about the state of gaming. But I beg of you to not be hateful towards this industry that we obviously love so much. The indie scene is the future of gaming. It is where all of the good ideas and great games are coming out from. In every era of gaming that I have lived through, I've suffered the potential death of a genre or an IP or some other sort of thing about gaming that I've loved, but it has always come back in some form or fashion now through the indie scene. I've even discovered genres that I now love through this scene because no AAA game studio would dare risk any sort of money on a game like Celeste or Omori. But the indie scene allowed that to happen, and because of that, and the following that they got through their sheer just excellence of being, they got the attention of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And I have been one of those millions of people. Survival horror died, but was reincarnated before my eyes by the popularity of indie games and the explosion of reaction-styled Let's Players on YouTube. So much so that it literally got Capcom out of a weird funk and made them take a chance to bring Resident Evil back to its roots and make the series a horror-focused one again. I was able to revitalize my love for horror games twofold through the indie scene and through the AAA scene. And while the AAA scene burns to the ground behind us now, we as consumers and people that love video games can and should look forward to the indie scene, because the indie scene is where you will find the next game, genre, or franchise that you can fall in love with all over again. I know that this doesn't solve the issue of the closures, the layoffs, and all of the other problems that are plaguing the industry at the moment, but show the creators of these games that you care and support indie games like Crow Country. Games like Crow Country aren't perfect. Games like Crow Country aren't revolutionary. But what games like Crow Country are is a promise that gaming will live on through today and into tomorrow. They're a promise that gaming can be experimental and creative and not be willing to cut every little last penny out of your wallet, and they're a promise that through everything, there will be new games to love. Crow Country helped remind me that survival horror is forever.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.
Oh yeah, did you know that these guys made snipper clips?